Hello everyone, how are you? I'm Arith and today I'm going to briefly talk about a prehistoric ancestor cult of the Iberian Peninsula. Although I must say, archaeologically speaking, we can trace several cults, religious and cultic displays of belief and even religions towards the ancestors in the Iberian Peninsula as far back as 1,400,000 years ago. So it's quite the extensive span of time of human occupation in the Iberian Peninsula. So I'm only going to focus today on a specific cult to the ancestors, on a specific material culture on shale slabs, such as this one right here, which isn't widespread all across the Iberian Peninsula, but mostly of central, western, southwestern and Atlantic Iberian Peninsula. I'm specifically going to focus on this one because it's also intimately tied with the cult to a very important goddess whose religion had a great impact, especially in terms of material culture and beliefs associated to it, on the local megalithic religions. So I brought you this one so you can see what I'm talking about. I would like you to meet Anna. Those of you on my Instagram met her before. This is a replica, don't worry. In fact, it is a little bit small compared to the real ones, which are about the size of a human's hand. You know, I'm an archaeologist, but I would never bring home the real thing that stays in the laboratory safe and sound. I'm not mad. Well, not extensively mad anyway. But replicas are being made, so I bought this one to show you. As I said, this is rather small compared to the real ones, which are about the size of this one right here, actually. And, well, surprise. Well, to a certain extent, there's both the reconstruction and the revival of this particular faith in the Iberian neo-paganism these days, especially in Portugal, which is the geographical area where most of this material culture was centered during the late Neolithic and the Chalcolithic periods. As I said, this is linked to the cult of a solar goddess, and I was this close to buy a replica, but it was super expensive and I would have to sell my clothes, underwear included, and probably the skin on my body. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Anyway, here's the solar goddess. Yeah, I've got you covered. This one wasn't as expensive as the replicas, got a pretty good deal out of it. Only had to sell my pants. Good gods. This is by far the most expensive video I've ever done, but I really wanted to show you these so you can have a better perception of what we are dealing with here today. Now, first of all, it is important to take into consideration that these gorgeous cronies are often called idols, and well, they have been so labeled until quite recently. And I remember my first years of archaeology, I had the luck to also work on these contexts, and we were still calling them idols, and it wasn't that long ago, mind you. However, the nomenclature is being changed because it's not appropriate anymore calling them idols. And the representation of this goddess herself, linked to this specific religious artistic style from the Western Iberian late Neolithic and early Chalcolithic, more or less 6,000 years ago, is also often labeled as an idol. There are many typologies of these idols, but not all of them represent deities. In fact, that is a common mistake and the very misconception that led to refer to such findings as idols due to their representation of the human body and face. The first interpretations of these anthropomorphic figures, an interpretation strongly marked by a Jewish Christian religious cultural perception, connected them with the notion of idol, understood as the expressions of primitive religious ideas linked to the development of the copper metallurgy. Idol very much in the sense of an object of worship representing a deity, but usually on a derogatory sense, as in a false element of worship as opposed to the Judeo-Christian God, right? So it's no longer appropriate to label them as idols for such reasons, but also because most of these objects with the exception of the Solar Goddess, we shall see further ahead, are not actually representations of deities, but are certainly objects of devotion, most likely also portable objects of devotion, but on a more sentimental level and quite unique and personal, even on a customized sense, because there are hundreds or thousands of these shale slabs, and also on other materials, of course, that surely follow the same religious artistic style and under the same patterns of a belief system, but there isn't one slab or plaque equal to another. They are all different because they were meant to represent real individuals, perpetuating their identities for all time. So, idols, right? Idols is no longer the correct term. Nowadays, the archaeological research has greatly changed, and it's now a science within the field of social human sciences, which has been developing several new methods and interdisciplinary work, as well as a thorough work of investigation and impartiality as much as possible, which leads to new and better conclusions. 21st century archaeology now interprets these idols from the social point of view as human expressions of high significance that helped standardize relationships and social ties in the groups of the end of the Neolithic and the Copper Age in the Iberian Peninsula. The detail that some of the species classified as idols offer and the presence of unique features lead to the conclusion that rather than deities, they could represent individuals, real human individuals, always within recognizable codes in specific territorial areas, following these specific patterns and artistic style, which help to recognize the individuals of a particular group or a widespread culture. As you can see, the unique geometrical decorations and the unique character of faces observed in these materials can be interpreted as the representation of the individuals that were buried precisely in the graves and burial mounds where these idols are often found. So let's start with a little historical background. About 9,000 years ago, agriculture and domestication began to transform European hunter-gatherer societies. Obviously at different paces and not an homogeneous evolution, but progressively developing across Europe about 9,000 years ago. As I said, a cultural phenomenon associated to the Atlantic civilizations and then spreading eastwards across Europe. This, of course, dealing with the Megalithic phenomenon in Europe. These developments, which changed the lives of human beings quite a lot, obviously led to cultural manifestations according to the new lifestyle, such as megalithism, which is a phenomenon associated with the Atlantic area and characterized by the construction of large stone monuments. Quite the distinct religious phenomenon that later evolved and spread throughout Europe. And, of course, there was also a development of anthropomorphic representations of a ritual character associated with megalithism. Therefore, on the Atlantic side of the Iberian Peninsula, the so-called idols made of stone predominate, most common in cylindrical shapes, but also decorated plates or slabs being practically exclusively of the West, not only in terms of the European West, but also in terms of the west of the Iberian Peninsula. Of course, we also see this artistic phenomenon in other materials such as bone, especially phalanges decorated with these elements and that represent an ocular entity. These decorations can also be found on other materials, such as in gold blades or plates, in the sense of a thin leaf. I think that is the appropriate designation. Also in ceramics, both in everyday use but also in votive ceramics, and of course there are also representations in megalithic monuments. So, what I just said previously, this religious art was much more common in the Atlantic part of the Iberian Peninsula, where representations in stone predominate. However, in the more Mediterranean part of the Iberian Peninsula, these anthropomorphic representations in bone predominate, mostly phalanges and long bones. However, long bones are more characteristic of the eastern part of the peninsula. So we have the perception of the economy of these prehistoric societies, where it seems to be clear that animal husbandry and hunting were much more common in the eastern part and in the Mediterranean part. But in the far west along the Atlantic, with a very different climate, the cultures were more connected to the land and agriculture predominated. And in a way, richer in the economic sense, since the abundance of gold was stronger, and that is why we also see these decorations in gold. In fact, I would like to share a curiosity with you, and I take the opportunity. Speaking of the Celts, it always comes to mind the iconic Celtic jewelry, such as torques and arm rings made of gold. And not only hundreds of thousands of these objects are precisely found in what is nowadays Portugal, especially the northern half, the extreme west of the Iberian Peninsula, but also many of the gold jewels of other Celtic peoples, especially torques, arm rings, bracelets and rings, especially of the British Isles. Much of the gold to make such materials came precisely from the Iberian West, and there was a great trade between the Atlantic peoples. Something curious that perhaps you may find useful. But of course, the Celts are late Bronze Age and Iron Age, and what we are dealing with today is the late Neolithic and the Chalcolithic periods. So these anthropomorphic representations, the so-called idols of the Iberian Peninsula, the distribution of these cultural phenomenon had the tendency to be centered on the southern half of the territory, although the idols on shale slabs, such as Anna here and well, her father, why not, are predominant in the west, and the representation of the goddess is more of an Atlantic phenomenon. And indeed it is curious to see that the great majority of megalithic monuments on the Atlantic side were the ones that have had a considerable damage during the Chalcolithic, when the cult to this goddess became stronger and came to replace the megalithic religions in this European geographic area. But the shale or schist slabs show a greater relation with megalithic monuments of the late Neolithic. Most of them are actually a plain Neolithic megalithic religious material culture, and most of them are found in megalithic burials actually, giving us clear indications that these idols are a response towards the religious and spiritual mentality around megalithic structures, especially of a funerary character. Therefore, we are facing a testimony of the cult of the dead in the prehistory of the far west of Europe. The megalithic monuments themselves are one of the main materializations of the ancestor worship, when the human being manifests the desire to build monuments to the dead, which not only may last forever, but they can also be visited, literally walking into the dwellings of the dead, of the ancestors, where worship and offerings were manifested. For the case we are dealing with today, the votive offerings to the ancestors that stand out the most are the engraved schist or shale plaques or slabs, an object strictly linked to the world of the dead. And as I said, we only find it in the southwest of the peninsula and in funerary contexts. We know that they were part of the funerary rituals of communities that lived between 3000 and 2500 before the Common Era. The vast majority date from around 3600 before the Common Era actually. So we are talking about an artistic religious phenomenon that begins practically 6000 years ago. And we know that these objects accompanied the dead on their last journey, being usually placed on the deceased individual's chest, so they often have one or two holes on top, and sometimes in the eyes, precisely to be hung. And speaking of the eyes, then later on, appears these slabs with representations of radiant eyes, which began to appear towards the end of the Neolithic and during the Chalcolithic, following the religious art of the cult of the solar goddess that progressively gains power during this time. And the representation of the eyes and the other characteristics of the goddess found in this type of art will progressively spread across the southern half of the Iberian Peninsula. A religious cult to a solar goddess that appears to have originally formed in the Atlantic area of the Iberian Peninsula and progressively developed further towards the center and east. Here we began to understand that the plaques not only represent real individuals, and we are facing a way of identifying the ancestors, but it is curious that later it ends up joining with the cult of a new goddess, and therefore we are facing figures of individuals from these communities connected to a mother goddess regulating the cycles of life, death, rebirth. A fusion of the megalithic phenomenon that in itself was already linked to death, rebirth and fertility, also joining the cult of the solar goddess of the Atlantic populations of the Iberian Peninsula. A protective deity of the dead and a symbol of life. This is no doubt let's say there is no doubt that the purpose of these figurines is the representation of human bodies, and later on with the development of the prehistoric religion of the solar goddess, these figures began to have a greater emphasis on feminine aspects and characteristics. Basically, these figures are social codes not only representing individuals but also their cultures, as we understand by the decorative elements and details such as clothing, makeup, paintings, possibly even tattoos, gender definition, which provides visual information not only for the peoples from these cultures but also to other individuals from outside and for future generations. Concerning the image I've hopefully shown you of the Iberian Solar Goddess, such idols, these shale slabs such as Anna here, but such other representations following this particular belief system made on lithic materials are predominant in the Atlantic side of the Iberian Peninsula. Nowadays mostly Portugal, right? And the decorated cylinders, usually engraved on limestone, but also plaques and betyls, can be mostly found in the West. The solar eyes generally occur in these typologies, as well as on stone plaques, which are the most numerous items and are varied in morphology, material and decoration. The solar eyes are also present on gold leaves, ceramic decoration and megalithic orthostates. As you can see, there is a standardized model of the face in the heads of the so-called anthropomorphic idols. The face is disproportionately represented on the materials that suggest the human body. With wide open eyes, they seem to contemplate everything around them. It seems to have been meant to watch over those who beheld them. The rayed-shaped eyes mimics that of the sun, hence often referred to as solar eyes or radiant eyes. They are represented in wood pieces and also in largely exclusively gold or ivory pieces. The carved lines that are interpreted as eyebrows or as expressions of a facial tattoo or a mask. So indeed, it is often an educated guess that most likely these people had facial tattoos similar to these horizontal lines below the eyes, across the face or over the cheeks, or at the very least these painted motifs representative of both the solar goddess but also the dead. Most likely such decorative patterns were either painted or on special occasions, or priests and priestesses even of this particular cult would have these motifs permanently tattooed or even carved by means of scarring on their faces. Sometimes the nose can be identified on these representations, while the mouth is barely represented or not represented at all, portraying a mute face that shows its powerful gaze. Which is rather curious, as the nose is a prominent feature on a person's face, which helps to identify the person, and the eyes follow the same line of thought. Although, in the case in this case, it's probably also with the objective to remain watchful. So the mouth isn't represented, at least in the case of the shale slabs, because they probably represent ancestors. And on an animistic perspective, they are not allowed to speak. They must not speak, but remain watchful. And this idea can be brought into the cylindrical representations of the goddess, remaining watchful, but the intention isn't to speak, but rather to emanate her powers, deliver her powers into the world of humans. We are here talking about a specific culture and the religion associated to it in a time period that overlaps the final stages of the megalithic religious phenomenon. In fact, it seems that this very religion around a solar goddess came to put an end to the megalithic religions. But it's still in a time period and in a specific geographical areas where agriculture, cattle raising or animal husbandry was still quite important in the economy of these people. So we are face to face with a goddess whose powers, in their great majority, must have been related to fertility. And I say this because one of the most prominent features of all the elements depicted in such objects, aside from the radiant eyes, which give her a solar character, it's precisely the representation of the feminine genitalia, with pubic hair and all, which can also be found in other materials of the period, including on pots, which may have been used to carry water, blessed by the goddess, or maybe even pots with an exclusive cultic purpose, so to carry in the substances sacrificed and or gifted to the goddess during expressions of belief towards this same deity. So even though many idols, which vary in typologies and are subject to regional variations, might indeed be the representation of individuals, this solar goddess representation of the Western Iberian Atlantic follows a strong, continuous and well-marked pattern, which may indeed be the representation of a powerful solar goddess, whilst the other idols, the other representations, mostly on shale slabs, specifically those, always have a unique representations and individual features representing specific persons, which seems to indicate that when someone died, the representation of their identity was carved on these slabs, following the artistic style and the religious characteristics around this goddess, especially when it comes to represent the eyes of these individuals. And then these representations were most likely carried by their descendants around their necks, as we clearly see purposely bored holes, so some sort of thread could go through and form a necklace. Or these necklaces would be placed precisely on the necks of the individuals whose representations were on these slabs, so they may be identified by both their descendants when visiting their graves, and to be recognized perhaps by the solar goddess herself in some afterlife of which we know nothing about, unfortunately, as we only have these materials that may tell many stories, but impossible to reveal the mysteries within the minds and hearts of those who are gone. But at least it seems clear that we are facing representations of real individuals of these communities, and their identities were permanently engraved as to not be forgotten by the living, no matter how much the world changes. I must say that the rayed circle motif is an astral illusion, of course, and one of the most characteristic motifs of the ancient Neolithic of the Iberian Peninsula. This symbology has been quite visible since at least 5600 before the Common Era, speaking specifically of rayed circles as representations of eyes, of course, because at least since the Mesolithic, circles and rays and some stylized representations of the sun are already observable. However, rayed or radiant circles were already quite common in the Iberian Peninsula 9,000 years ago, but only about more or less 5,000 years ago, in some cases almost 6,000 years ago, we finally see them clearly associated with a specific entity, with a cultural identity, and not just an abstract artistic expression. Let's say that the solar motifs on the Iberian Peninsula are finally associated with a deity with clear material representations of a culture 5,000 years ago. It is during this period that we finally began to see these motifs represented in pairs, an exaggerated representation of the eyes being an element inserted in a composition that represents a face and an identity, emphasizing an expression that seems to be always watchful. You have probably noticed that a lot of these representations on shale slabs seem to depict owls. And it's perfectly understandable. Indeed, many of them look like owls. The idea of looking like owls is curious. When I was studying this period in college and these findings, we still refer to these schist or shale slabs as owls. It is true that some researchers have suggested that the ocular decorations, specifically the radiant eyes, may be representations of the Mother Goddess in her owl form, as a symbol of regeneration and death. The owl has an extraordinary vision, especially in the dark, and in this way its eyes have become for millennia a symbol of regeneration and profound wisdom. Since it is possible that they are representations of the dead, of specific ancestors to be more precise, it would not be strange a representation that could also provide a glimpse of a bird, especially an owl. Many myths of antiquity, especially in the Iberian Peninsula, Scandinavia and the Italian Peninsula, Northern Africa as well, birds were believed to be the souls of the dead or the ancestors. Hence, much of the augury performances is precisely the observance of birds, the ancestors transmitting knowledge about future events. And this is well known in many cultures, and in Europe it's a strong cultural aspect of Western Europe, including Scandinavia, especially Western Scandinavia, that shares a lot of cultural similarities and influences with prehistoric Atlantic cultures. In the case of the cylindrical representations of the goddess, it is not genderless, because the vast majority of these representations include a symbolic or stylized representation of the female reproductive organ. That's why we know that it is a feminine divinity and not particularly an owl. Besides, representations of the goddess are often missing other prominent facial representations, such as the mouth and the nose. So it's exclusively a focus on characteristics that reflect her greater powers, both the eyes and the female genitalia, the power of the sun and the radiance of the goddess over fertility and reproduction. But indeed, the representations of ancestors may, or many of such representations include a nose indeed, which is akin to an owl. And one of my patrons pointed out, and I think it's a very good example actually, the Egyptian hieroglyphs, the bird with a human head is the Ba, which is the soul. Ba is represented as a human-headed bird that leaves the body when a person dies. And the head is precisely the representation of the person of that specific individual, so not a random or standardized artistic model. So indeed, some of these representations in this Iberian cult to the ancestors could indeed be linked to a bird and the idea of the ancestors becoming birds and fly off after death, or becoming actual birds. So it would not be strange that these would represent bird-like anthropomorphic figures as well, since there's a vast prehistoric system of belief that links the dead ancestors to birds, although there are no certainties in this specific context. What we know for sure is that they do follow the same artistic style of the representation of the goddess with the radiant eyes. It's of the same period and practically the same cultural areas. These representations of the ancestors have the same eyes of the goddess, and the facial tattoos probably also painted motifs. It's possible that there were some sort of priestesses to this goddess, and they would paint their eyes red with the representations of the rays of the sun, radial eyes. Maybe even the newly deceased would also have their eyes painted in a same manner to be sent to the goddess or in honor of this goddess. Eyes would shut in this world, and upon arriving in the new world, they would open up again and see the light of the goddess. And perhaps this representation of the eyes represents enlightenment, and the dead were often considered to be very wise. Could be such a case, indeed. So again, if we remember that birds were considered to be the souls or the spirits of the dead, and that augury through the observation of the flight of birds was a divinatory art in search for prophecy, or in other words, having knowledge of the future or future events only the wisdom of the dead can reveal, well, here we have a possible link with the knowledge of the dead and their ability to foretell the future. There could be some hybrid motif here, indeed, but best not push it too far, as it isn't certain, but could be a possibility, of course. For a very long time, and indeed since the discovery of these figures, the very first thing they have been called were precisely owls. So this immediate similarity may have been on purpose. Just before this video comes to an end, I would like to propose another possible interpretation for the representations of the goddess with the radiant eyes. Something that was pointed to me by a woman, a very dear and close friend of mine, dear Theresa, whose perspective made me see things differently. And I specifically emphasized woman, and you will understand why in a moment. It may be that in this representation of the solar goddess, we are not actually looking at eyes, but rather at breasts. After let's say, the light bulb lit inside my head, I have shown the representations of the goddess to several people, and I've asked them to describe what they were seeing. And it was curious that the great majority of women saw breasts, and the great majority of men saw eyes. I've also made this experiment with archaeologists, colleagues of mine, that never studied these contexts as to avoid biases, and indeed most people in general were more predisposed to see breasts rather than eyes. And indeed it may be so. Let's not forget that the representations of this goddess are almost always lacking a nose, and sometimes the nose is only perceptible on shale slabs, which seem to represent real human individuals, and perhaps even giving the impression of birds as previously spoken. The representation of the goddess often lacks the nose, and when the nose is visible, it may not be a nose at all, but we shall get to it. Also, the representations of this goddess are always missing a mouth. It is clear that these figures, especially in the cylindrical ones, represent a human body, but it is strange the lack of facial features. So indeed the human body here represented may be the feminine human body, and what we think to be a representation of the eyes are actually feminine breasts. The nipple, the areola, the circle area surrounding the nipple, and what seems to be rays of the sun forming the radiant eyes may actually be the mammary lobes. The horizontal lines below the supposed eyes, which have been interpreted as paint or facial tattoos or scars, facial decorations of this cult and the association to this goddess, may actually be the ribs, representing the rest of the body. The line that sometimes appears in the center, which is often interpreted as the nose, but more often than not that line is often missing, may be the representation of either the center of the body or the spine. Let's not forget that this goddess has clear associations with death, so the horizontal lines and the central vertical line may be the representation of the skeleton, representing the connections to death, and above the ribs, a great emphasis on the breasts, because she is also a goddess with clear reproductive and fertility characteristics. And indeed, death and fertility often walk hand in hand to represent renewal, restoration, revival, and rebirth. In this way, when we see on shale slabs characteristics in decorations that are similar or even equal to the supposed radiant eyes, maybe they are also representations of breasts to indicate that those specific shale slabs are representations of real women of the community. Such shale slabs placed on the breast of the deceased women or people who identify themselves as women, precisely to identify them post-mortem, right? Perhaps this becomes clearer if we take into consideration the exact same decorations of this goddess in pottery, which often show the vulva, the female genitalia and reproductive system, and here it is more perceptible the feminine human body. So perhaps we are not in the presence of eyes or any facial features, but actually the representation of a goddess lacking facial features, therefore lacking a recognizable identity that would instead give her one single identity. But we may actually be in the presence of simply and only the representation of the female body, giving to this goddess a more general identity, a collective identity. So instead of a specific single identity, it may be in fact a representation of all women and or the feminine, represented in a mother goddess, and the powers of life and death, fertility and rebirth, combining all the aspects of life provided by feminine life-giving deities. Let's take into consideration that much of Paleolithic lithic art focuses on the female body, sometimes with heads, sometimes only the body, but even the heads, such as the case of the so-called Paleolithic Venuses, don't have great detail concerning an identity and rarely represent specific facial features, but instead there's a greater focus and indeed a lot more detail on the body rather than the face. The female image is characteristic of the earliest phases of Paleolithic fertility art. Therefore, in the representation of this Neolithic Iberian supposedly solar goddess, we can really be in the presence of the continuation of a strong culture around fertility and around the feminine and the reproductive aspects of both wild nature and nature domesticated by humanity. Let's not forget that the vast majority of history for centuries was dominated by the male gender, and even archaeology began as an amateur activity among the European nobility and exclusively for men. So when artifacts do not represent gender identity in detail, the trend is always towards a quick assumption that something is masculine precisely because it is being interpreted by men. And sadly, I also very much include myself in that, because I could never see breasts here before my dear friend pointed it out to me. So there's still a strong biased perception in academia, male perception, all right, in academia, unfortunately. In the case of this goddess, she is clearly a goddess, but perhaps because it is a more schematic, even almost stylized representation of the female body, perhaps the perception was wrong and seen as eyes when in fact they may be breasts, precisely for the lacking of the feminine intuition and interpretation in these contexts, lacking a critical look from someone who is more familiar with the female human body and all its unique details and characteristics. This is just another possible interpretation. Of course, this one changes much of what we think we know about this goddess and this artistic style, but at least it remains the representation of a feminine figure, and the connections to death, fertility, rebirth and the ancestors also remains. Mostly, this interpretation only comes to remove the solar aspects of the goddess and focuses much more on her chthonic character, ceasing to be a solar goddess to become an earth goddess, therefore linked to everything that encompasses the reality of the world, including a connection to the underworld, to the underground, the earth beneath our feet. Alright, my dear friends, I do hope you have enjoyed today's video. I very much hope this was useful. As I said, this was by far the most expensive video I have ever done, so I want to give a special thanks to all of my patrons without whom this video would surely not be possible. This was a 2-year work which greatly counted on the contributions of my patrons, which have helped me to acquire the sources for study and the replicas, as well as to cover other expenses. So a very special thanks to all of my patrons. Thank you all for your contributions, support, and most importantly, at least to me, thank you for your friendship. And obviously, a special thanks to all of you who subscribe to this channel and watch my videos. I'm also aware of you. I never forget you. Thank you so much for your kindness and friendship. So, as always, thank you for today. Farewell. That was Teresa.